My favorite sci-fi series are the Hyperion Cantos and the Remembrance of Earth's Past. But Sun Eater is hot on their heels. Hello BookTube, I'm Jonathan and welcome to Words in Time. Today I'm excited to talk to you about Book 5 of the Sun Eater series by Christopher Ruocchio, Ashes of Man. And I was actually lucky enough to receive an early copy from the publisher, so thank you to Christopher Ruocchio, Dor and Astra for that, and I'm really looking forward to sharing my spoiler-free thoughts on the book, as well as let you guys know where Sun Eater currently ranks within my favorite sci-fi series. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was the style, because Sun Eater does form a cohesive story, but each of the books in this series kind of have their own unique style. So the first book, Empire of Silence, was kind of a coming-of-age space adventure, and then the second book, Howling Dark, felt a little bit more dark and gothic, had some cyberpunk elements in there as well. And then the third book, Demon in White, really just expands the universe. The political stakes, the sci-fi concepts really start to expand. And then book 4, Kingdoms of Death, is definitely the darkest, grittiest, hardest read of the series so far. So Ashes of Man, you may know this, was originally written as part of Kingdoms of Death. It was a longer book that was split into two due to a paper shortage. So it does feel a little bit like Kingdoms of Death. It does share some similar qualities, but there's also a natural breaking point at the end of Kingdoms of Death, and something kind of new comes out of that in Ashes of Man, and it explores some of my favorite elements from Empire of Silence and Demon in White, with some of the political consequences and machinations and all of that good stuff that Sun Eater does so well. Something that I've noticed while reading Sun Eater, and in particular Ashes of Man, is that each scene feels like it has a very clear purpose. When reading a book, I think one of the worst things that you can experience is finishing a scene and wondering, what was the point of that scene? Especially when you get to the end of the book and you still don't know what this point of that scene was. Whereas in reading Sun Eater, reading Ashes of Man, I felt like every scene had a very clear objective and was just executed perfectly. I think Ruocchio is an absolute master of this, and it was really rewarding seeing kind of each of those objectives come to fruition, and not just in isolation, but when you were able to look back and see how he was able to paint a vision across the whole book as a whole. I think it's just absolutely masterfully done. Now, there's a technique used in the series that I felt was used quite a lot in Empire of Silence, and then perhaps a little bit less so in the subsequent books, that felt to me at least like it made a little bit more of a return in Ashes of Man. And that is future Hadrian, the Hadrian that is writing this story, the tale of his life, providing a little bit of extra information, a little bit of commentary on past Hadrian, or what was going on at the time, at the point that we are up to in the story. And this is a technique that I really enjoy for two reasons. The first reason is that I really enjoy the contrast between younger Hadrian and older Hadrian. This story takes place over an epic span of time, and we can definitely see that younger Hadrian was a little bit more ambitious and impulsive, whereas older Hadrian feels more wise, and you can tell he's definitely carrying an emotional weight. And as we get closer to the end of the series, we can feel that younger Hadrian aging and becoming more and more like the older Hadrian. I think the character development in this series is just absolutely phenomenal. The second reason I like this storytelling technique is that Hadrian is able to provide some foreshadowing, drop some little hints, some clues, some mysteries that really just pique my interest, hook me in, grab my attention, and just kind of give the story that little bit of extra momentum as I try to figure out what exactly is going to happen further ahead in the story. And I think it works especially well because the character of Hadrian definitely has a talent for drama. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was the pacing, because Ashes of Man is a little bit different in this regard, as the sequels in the Sun Eater series have all started with a bit of a time jump from the previous book. Whereas Ashes of Man, which was originally written alongside Kingdoms of Death, we follow on from where we left off with Kingdoms of Death. And I actually like this for a couple of reasons. The first is that after the heavy emotional experience of reading Kingdoms of Death, I like that we had a little bit of time to breathe, a little bit of time to process things to kind of play out before we picked up the action again. And secondly, this was the first time I'd had a little bit of a gap in my Sun Eater reading experience. So I read the first 3 books quite close together, and then luckily I only had to wait 2 or 3 months for the release of Kingdoms of Death. But now it's been about 8 or 9 months that I had to wait for Ashes of Man. So this is quite an expansive world with a lot of locations, a lot of characters, and so that I like that we had a little bit of a slower start as I was just able to kind of reintroduce myself to the series, remember all the characters, the places, and kind of feel at home in that world again before taking off on another space adventure. And from there, I felt like the pacing was absolutely perfect. I feel like Sun Eater is a series that has always had good pacing, but I felt particularly in Ashes of Man, each time we followed a particular storyline or visited a certain location, we spent just enough time there to get some really meaty development, but we moved on just before it started to grow a little bit stale and I started to want something else. This book always kept me on my toes, and that could either be a combination of this book being a little bit shorter, about 500 pages rather than 700 or 800, or it just could be because Ruocchio is getting more and more in tune with this universe, kind of getting a feel for the pacing, and just absolutely nailed it with Ashes of Man. Moving on to the characters, I honestly think that Christopher Ruocchio might be the best writer of characters and dialogue in all of science fiction. Hadrian Marlowe is one of my favorite characters of all time, and seeing as this series is written in first person from his point of view, I think it would be hard for the series to be successful without me being interested or intrigued in Hadrian, which I very much am. But something that really impresses me about this series is the number of characters that just feel fully fleshed out, multi-dimensional, important to the series, and I'm emotionally invested in. I tried to think of these characters that I felt like mattered to me, and I got over 20 characters before I stopped counting. There's just so many characters in this fully epic world that Ruocchio has just written so well, and I feel connected to so many of them, and that's why some of the things that happen, especially in the last couple of books, have emotionally resonated so strongly with me. And something else I found kind of interesting was how Ruocchio was able to introduce a couple of new characters, which I think is something that can be quite hard to do later on in a series. You know when you're watching a sitcom and around season 7 or 8, some new characters get introduced and you're like, I don't like these characters, you're not part of the crew. Even though they're probably a very talented actor or actress, and even the lines could be very funny, you've grown attached to the characters that we have. It's kind of like once you get into your 30s, it's kind of harder to make new friends. You're like, I've got what I got, and I'm sticking with them. Well, in Sun Eater, in Ashes of Man, Ruocchio introduces a couple of new characters that instantly I grew attached to. I don't know how he did it, but almost immediately I thought, I actually kind of want more screen time, more pages from these people. So I'm very excited to see what he does with book 6 as well. So guys, when it comes to the ending of this book, Ashes of Man absolutely floored me. And that's not a metaphor. I was reading this book on the floor, and it took me a solid 20 minutes to get up after having finished reading it. I just needed some time to process what the heck I had just read. It was a little bit like, you almost have a little bit of an incident on the road and you're just kind of sitting there in your car for a minute waiting for the adrenaline to pass. Or to give a more positive example, maybe you hit the game winner for your sports team and crowd goes crazy, your teammates are all cheering you on, and then you're just kind of sitting in the locker room afterwards thinking, that just happened. That's kind of what the ending of Ashes of Man felt like to me. Floored me, absolutely shook. If I had any minor notes on the book, I would say that the action, while still really good, perhaps didn't quite reach the levels of some of the other battles we've read in previous books. And I'd also say that there were some sci-fi, sci-fantasy concepts introduced in a couple of other books that just completely blew me away, really kind of took the series to a new level. And Ashes of Man definitely had some really cool moments, but there wasn't necessarily a new element that raised it to an all-time favorite, my number 1 in the series. So just quickly, before I give my final rating, if you want to join us and talk about Sun Eater or some of your favorite other sci-fi books, feel free to check out the link to my Discord server in the description. And if you're interested in some of the perks of becoming a patron, such as voting on my TBR and joining video hangouts, then check out the link to see how you can become one of my robots, androids, or cyborgs like Nima and a New Eden. So overall, what is my rating for Ashes of Man? Well, in this book, we get some phenomenal character development, some really layered intergalactic politics, and when it comes to the world building, I think this book gives us some really interesting answers on the lore, some of the mysteries within the series, but also still posing some interesting questions that need to be answered as well. For me, Ashes of Man was a 9 out of 10. I think Demon in White is still my favorite in the series, but after that, it is right up there with some of my favorite books in the Sun Eater series. So where does Sun Eater rank within my favorite sci-fi series? Well, after 5 amazing entries, I can definitely say it's within my top 3 favorites. And with one book to come, I think the final book will determine which rank 1, 2, or 3 is going to end up with for me. I would say that in the unlikely event that the final book doesn't quite stick the landing for me, I think it's probably going to end up 3rd. I don't think it would really fall below that just because of how good all of the books have been so far. If it stays around the same level, I think that would probably put it on a similar average rating for me as the other 2 series, but with 6 books instead of just 4 and 3, I think that would give the slight edge to Sun Eater. And if I love the final book, if it's the best in the series, then it will become my clear #1 sci-fi series of all time. So there you go, guys. Those are my thoughts on Ashes of Man. Let me know your thoughts on the series, and if you haven't read it yet, let me know whether I have finally sold you on it. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, subscribe to the channel. It's free, and you can find more sci-fi content over here.